Hopefully, you can all hear me. And I'm checking my microphone here. Good Friday morning. Happy Friday, everyone. And welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. I don't know if that is my voice. Uh, Somebody said at some point there were some improvements in my side effects of having COVID, maybe. Welcome to this episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show, where I talk about, um, I want to say challenges, but also how to make SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery practical. This week's topic is something that I've seen, and one of the benefits of doing the work that I do is I get front row seats into the environments that my customers and my clients work with, and I also get front row seats and talk to the very people who support it. Sometimes there are cases when somebody else would build the environment and then they would hand it off to somebody, and then the operational team or a DBA team would be the one responsible for taking care of it. Either or, there are patterns, and the one of the reasons why I really want to talk about this is because, for one, I've seen numerous cases, so many cases where an engineer, a DBA, is already supporting a high availability and disaster recovery solution. Take, for instance, failover clustered instance or an availability group. More often than not, the mindset or the way of thinking that most people think is that, oh, I just need to know how this thing works. They would dive into learning failover clustering, availability groups, failover clustered instances, and all these technologies and features. They would spend their time trying to learn it, although in most cases they couldn't, because there's just so much time in a day and they are working 12, 14-hour days. And the the common misconception is it's enough for me to have the technical skills and the technical know-how to do this. And like I said, I the there's something about seeing not just the infrastructure, but also the people who are taking care of the infrastructure and understanding who they are and what they are. Somebody actually once mentioned, one of my clients mentioned, why do you focus so much on the the psychology of the person? That's because, for one, once the technology is out there, it's out there. It's built, it's stable, it's reliable, just like an availability group. If you did everything correctly, if you configured it, built it, designed it properly, it's stable, reliable, it's a set and forget kind of thing. And typically, when things go wrong, there was an outage, there was a disaster, a database all of a sudden is not accessible. It's the state of mind of the person. In fact, I'm going to talk about this. How people respond to this goes beyond the technical know-how, the skills. And that's why I want to talk about the three things that DBAs and sysadmins, and I included sysadmins here because more often than not, the sysadmins are being brought in to support this, even though they have no clue at all how a SQL Server high availability solution works. They, in most cases, even, especially in regulated environments or when you have like segregation of duties, the Windows sysadmins will build the failover cluster based on their understanding of how a failover cluster works, and then hand it off to the DBAs, the database team, to build either the failover clustered instance or the availability group. And sometimes what SQL Server actually needs to support and fulfill its role or its function is not enough because the design is not properly done. But again, I want to zoom into the three things that DBAs and sysadmins need. Well, if you are a database developer and you suddenly see yourself, not see, you have been voluntold to take care of a high availability and disaster recovery solution like an availability group or failover clustered instance, chances are it's the same thing that's going through your mind. I need to learn this. So you go ahead and try and learn it as much as you can. You watch a ton of YouTube videos where they show you how, and then you try to replicate it. And then next thing you know, oh, I'm good. I can do this. But then when operation starts, meaning the infrastructure is out in a production environment and you're now supporting it, that is where the real action happens, right? Designing, implementing is easy. It's the day-to-day operations. Because when you start to think about the life cycle of an entire HADR solution, the design and implementation phase would probably last a few months at most. I've seen cases where because the tech team, because sometimes it's the sysadmins, the server admins, the hardware, the tech team would take months for them to buy the hardware necessary for this. And then once they have the hardware, they would configure the OS, configure the failover cluster, hand it off to the DBA, and then they would deploy it. The deployment stage from the design to the implementation phase would take roughly months from start to finish. Cut over to production. But when you start cutting over to production and it's go live, that would take years. The life cycle would take years until you decide, hey, I want to upgrade to a new version, a new version. Like 2022 is coming out in a few months, I'm guessing. I have no idea when it is going out, but I'm already working on. I'm already working on some of the. I can't even pronounce that name, so I'm not even going to attempt to do that. But I'm already. By the way, I'm already testing some of the features of SQL Server 2022. But the point is, in a life cycle of your HADR solution, the deployment, the design and implementation phase is short relatively compared to the operations phase. And that's why I want to focus on supporting it, because you will be spending most of your time supporting it, not building, designing. Unless you're like me, who's who has to deal with mostly the design, implementation, and troubleshooting. But you will be spending most of your time supporting it. And unless you have these three things, you would end up, I want to say, in a sometimes fight or flight state, sometimes in a totally panicked state, that none of what you have done in the design implementation would actually carry on to, the production operational support, right? So if you have, I've got my pen and paper. Well, paper. I write things down. I'm old school here. Three things that DBAs and sysadmins, and if you're also a database developer and you're responsible for taking care of SQL Server available, always on, whether it's failover clustered instance or high availability solution, this is for you. Get a pen and paper ready. Write this down. I'm just going to grab a drink. There we are. Okay, so first thing that you need to properly support an HADR solution is, number one, you need to know how to find the real problems, not the symptoms. You need to know how to find the real problems and know exactly what you need to do when those problems occur. I'll say that again. You need to know how to find the real problems, not the symptoms, the real problems, and know exactly what you need to do to deal with them. I'll give you a very simple example. I was working with a client, this was a couple of years ago, and surprisingly, even though we have gone through different versions of Windows and SQL Server, I still see the same design over and over again. And again, there's nothing wrong with the design, but I just don't understand why people do this. It's a two-node Windows Server failover cluster with two replicas across two different data centers. Yes, I just want you to picture that. Two-node Windows Server failover cluster with two replica availability groups across two different data centers. Some people would design it because they know exactly what they want with it. Others would just design it and think it's how it should be done. This particular client, when they built it, it was a Windows guy who had more of a sysadmin background than a DBA background, designed it, and then he left. I think this was SQL Server 2014 was the version. And when when the client came up to me, they asked me, how come we're getting a ton of these outages? Initially, what they did was they started changing the voting option from one of the nodes, in this case, the node in the DR data center. And this is what I mean by knowing how to solve the real problem versus the symptom. And what's really interesting is I've worked with dozens of these cases where you have two node failover cluster, two replica availability group, and they're experiencing the same thing. And I asked the same question about, so why did you design it this way? And somebody else did it, and now we have to deal with it. Properly supporting an HA solution, you need to know how to figure out what the real problem is. The real problem in this case is not the fact that the secondary node in the DR data center is capable of voting. The real problem here is the fact that the design is not appropriate. It's the wrong design. And so they insist on it because, well, somebody else did it. And it's causing issues along the entire life cycle, to a point where when we were having this conversation, um, the person said, I spend more time trying to troubleshoot the problem that I feel like it is repetitive. It keeps happening and I have no control over it, until I just said, your real problem is really the design. And you could be preventing all of these problems down the road if only you would build and design the infrastructure properly. I like solving problems. I really do like solving problems. It's just that my way of thinking is, if we can prevent those problems from happening in the first place by doing the design properly, why don't we? Right? Now, there will be cases where trying to redesign everything would be a total nightmare. It would cost so much. But then this is your job as somebody who's supporting this, to explain and communicate it to the stakeholders, the business, the managers. We are spending so much time on the operation and support of this thing that the issue keeps happening. It's better to just redesign it, because most people would think, oh, it is going to cost us if we redesign it, but they're not calculating the operational cost. People are talking about capital expenditures versus operational expenditures, and I don't want to dive into that because that's mostly for management. But the reality is, if you're solving the same problem over and over and over and over again, it keeps happening, or it's happening in a totally different way, but it's still the root cause, then it just makes sense to redesign. And that's one example of finding the real problem, not the symptom. The symptom is, oh, the cluster is coming offline. We don't need that vote. We'll take it out, right? I've seen it so many different dozens of cases where they would do something thinking that they would tweak that specific setting and the problem would go away. Another client of mine, they have a massively large cluster spanned across two data centers, 4 nodes in one data center, 4 nodes on Azure, because that's their DR data center. And the one thing that they experience, same thing, the cluster would go offline when when the network between those two data centers become unavailable. And they said, do we move the file share to a different data center? So again, they're trying to solve the problem by addressing the symptom, not the root cause. So that's the first one. In order for you to properly support an HADR solution, You need to know how to find the real problem, not just the symptom, because resolving the symptom, it is just going to recur in the future. Knowing how to find the real problem, digging into the root cause, and knowing exactly what you need to do. Not putting on band-aids, not tweaking configuration, but really getting into the root cause and coming up with a solution. That's the first one. And like I said, most sysadmins, DBAs, or anybody who is responsible for taking care of availability groups or failover clustered instances would always go into, how do I configure this? How do I tweak this? How do I change this? And I want to use the sports analogy now because I started running. Tweaking and modifying settings when you're not dialed in would just cause more problems in the future, right? You have to first make sure that everything is dialed in, meaning the design is properly done correctly, the configuration is done properly. And like I said, if you do everything the way they're supposed to be done, with the proper best practices, configuration, design, everything, it's a set and forget thing. Once it's out in production, once it's live, you don't even recognize that you have something in there because you barely touch it. You would probably touch it once a month when you have to install Windows or SQL Server patches. That's it. Okay. So that's the first one. Knowing how to find the real problem. And this is not just about your technical skills. This goes beyond knowing what to do. You have to ask the right question. And knowing how to ask the right question would lead you to the root cause, right? In fact, it's interesting because when I would challenge a design, people would immediately ask, "So why do you know immediately without even um, exploring the configuration settings?" Because I only focus on one thing. What is the goal? Is the goal to build a cluster, or is the goal achieve high availability with the recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, SLAs, both for HA and DR? If we can't even be clear on that, there's no point in talking about, how many replicas, how many availability groups, how many nodes. There's no point in talking about that, right? So that's the first one. And I'm emphasizing this a lot because it is going to dictate how you would properly support an HADR solution. Second is that you need to have the confidence to do what needs to be done. And I say confidence because I've seen so many DBA, sysadmins, engineers, they've been supporting high availability solutions for years. They've done database mirroring, log shipping, failover clustering, availability groups, but they don't know what's happening under the covers. They just know, if this happens, this is what I'll do. For instance, if a database goes out of sync in an availability group, going back to point number one, where you're dealing with the root cause and not the symptom. If a database in an availability group goes out of sync, and that is affecting the entire availability group, what they would do is they would just resynchronize it. It's like how they did it with database mirroring. And then it happens again. But they don't know exactly what is going on, right? So that's why point number two is the second thing that you need if you are supporting an availability group or failover clustered instance or any type of high availability and disaster recovery solution, is you need to have the confidence to do what needs to be done. And sometimes you will get pushbacks on this because the people who've designed it would have their own agenda. People who deployed it would have their own agenda. Sometimes they don't even want you to do anything, because it's a reflection of what they did. And some people would say that's really just political. For me, and that's one of the reasons why I keep going back to the goal. Whether some other person did it right or not is not for me to question. In fact, when the DBAs or the sysadmins were left supporting it and it's a problematic system, and they would blame the previous guy who built it, I said, no, we cannot, because he only did what he thought was right during that time. And now you're here, responsible for taking care of this. You know what needs to be done. Let's go ahead and do it. No finger pointing, no blaming, because it is not going to lead you to achieving your goal. That's why it is important. You have to have the confidence to do what needs to be done. And getting that confidence means you have to upskill, learn, build your skills. One of the reasons why I recommend go on a training class, build your own environment. This is the only way to build those skills. In fact, somebody asked me at one time during the Q&A session for for my training class. They asked me, how do you build the skills when you have not had an environment like this? Well, that's one of the reasons why you're in this training class, is to build the skills so that when you need it, you're ready for it. You don't, and again, I've seen this so many times where people have been supporting it. They kind of know because they've read an article that when you encounter this problem, this is exactly what you do. And again, going back to point number one, you need to know what the root cause is rather than addressing the symptom. Sure, they have the skills to do X, and that X could be remove the availability group replica and then add it back. But then it would take long. Oh, remove the database and add it back. They know how to do that, but doing the right thing, they're not really confident because they're not sure what the impact is. Part of building that confidence is, number one, having the skills, and skills is just 80% of it. Having the skills, the technical skills rather, to deal with a high availability solution, uh, working on it, simulating it. This is part of the preparation. Now you might be thinking, I don't have the time. And that's why you need to build in the time. That's an investment on yourself. Okay. The third thing, and this is huge because this is something that I see when a real disaster happens. I have been involved in numerous cases where there was an outage. The people who built it, the people who support it, they are there. But when they know what they need to do, right? They know what the real problem is. They try to deal with the real problem instead of the symptom. They have the confidence to do what needs to be done, meaning they were properly trained, they have the skills, they have the experience, but they don't have this third thing. And that is, they don't have the right state of mind when dealing with a disaster. The thing about outages and disasters is that if you don't encounter them on a regular basis, when you get on a troubleshooting exercise where it is a real disaster, it is completely different when you have your CEO, your CIO behind you, watching over your shoulder, looking at what you're doing and asking, how long is this going to take? How long is this going to take? That screws people up. And like I said, one of the reasons why you are building your skills and your confidence is that you want the skills to be second nature, that it happens. Mastery is the key here. But again, if you don't do this on a regular basis, you kind of forget. And this is where the state of mind comes in. In a real disaster, and this is what I always tell people, there's a reason why police officers, firefighters, people in the military, they would train, even though they don't do that every day. The soldiers, even, they would train every single day so that when they're ready to go to war, they don't have to. In the same way, when you're dealing with high availability and a disaster recovery solution, you don't expect disasters to happen every day. That would screw you up. And because you don't get to deal with this on a daily basis, when it hits, when it happens, if you don't have a proper process in place, if you don't have your recovery point, recovery time objectives, and your SLAs defined, if you don't have the right escalation process in place, if you don't have the skill and the confidence to do what needs to be done, this would screw you up. I've even seen people who have the right skill set, the experience, the technical expertise, all of that, but when a real disaster happens, they freak out. Why? Because they've not experienced it ever. Just like when you get into an accident, you don't know how to respond because you've never been in an accident before. Same thing. So you have to be in the right state of mind. Like I said, I could not count the number of cases where they would bring me in. The databases have been offline for hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. They would call me. They would ask me to fix the problem. A couple of minutes later, system's up and running. They ask me, how can you do that? And I tell them, it has got nothing to do with just knowing what to do. It does not have anything to do with just having the confidence to do it, because you can have those two. You can know what you need to do, solve the problem instead of the symptom. You can have the confidence because you have the skills, the expertise. But if you freak out and you freeze because you've never experienced like this before, you won't be able to do the job. This is part of the conditioning. And again, if you're supporting this and it is in your responsibility to deal with a disaster, ask yourself the question: do you have the skills to identify the real problem, dig into the root cause, and do what needs to be done? And I'm emphasizing all of these things because you need to have all three. Not just one, not just two, but all three. You may be in the right state of mind, but if you don't know what you need to do, then there's no point. You won't be able to do it. You need to condition yourself in order to do the work. And again, the bigger challenge here is you've done a really good job of stabilizing. You've done a really good job with the deployment, the design, implementation. It's stable, it's reliable. Set and forget. You only touch your high availability solution once a month when you need to patch Windows or SQL Server. So you kind of don't experience any issues at all. That's ideal. But then you have to practice. You have to practice. I remember doing, I think it was one of my training classes where we simulate a real life outage. And somebody mentioned, man, that is nuts. I've been a DBA for a decade. I've done a lot of these things, and just seeing something go offline right before your very eyes is scary. It is scary, especially if you've never seen it before. It is scary. But how you respond, in fact, he was saying, I felt like my heart skipped a beat when I saw the cluster go offline and then the databases go offline, and now we're trying to troubleshoot it. It will help you, to stay calm. And for me, this is, I don't know, maybe because it has been part of my background growing up in a country where we do encounter natural disasters on a regular basis, typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. And for me to keep calm when real disaster happens is just normal. And that's one of the reasons why I emphasize on this, because in a real disaster, you're not concerned about failing over. You're not concerned about bringing stuff online. In a real disaster, your biggest concern is your safety. Somebody else on the other side of the world may be the one doing the failover. They may be the one doing the disaster recovery exercise, invoking everything, and now they're trying to bring the secondary data center online. And if they don't have all these three things, they don't know what the real problem is, they don't know what to do, they don't have the confidence, and they're not in the right state of mind, the outage is going to take much longer than you intended to, right? And so don't just deal with the technical aspects. Again, it is very difficult to even explain how people respond. to this until they would call me in, bring me in to solve the problems, because your team needs to be ready. If you're supporting this, especially I've seen organizations where they have level 1, level 2, and level 3 support. Level 1 would just open a ticket. They won't even look at the problem. They'll just look at the error message, open a ticket. They escalate it to level 2. Level 2 will be the one to start looking at this. And even if the level 2 and the level 3 um, engineers have been working on supporting it for years, but they don't know what is going on under the covers, they are still limited by what they can do. And that's why you have to constantly understand what is going on within your network, how things work under the covers. And that would build the confidence because you already have the experience and the skills. But in addition to that, is having the right state of mind. People in the SQL Server support team, people that you call when you have issues, they don't get phased when an outage occurs because, for one, they've seen a lot of these. Part of their day-to-day is deal with outages, not their own, but their other customers, of course. When it's their own system that's down, it's totally different, right? So these are three things that you need. You need. If you want to properly support an HADR solution, whether it's failover clustered instances, availability groups, it's not enough for you to know what you need to do. It's not enough for you to have the skills, the expertise, and experience. You need all three, including the right state of mind in order to do what needs to be done. Right? I am not going to attempt, because I just saw a comment here. What is the difference between failover cluster and FCI that really impact to configure HADR? I don't quite understand what the question here is. If you can provide context. This is also one of the reasons why it's very difficult to answer questions directly without the proper context, because I am limited by what I can say based on the question. And that's one of the reasons why I invite people to book a strategy session, because there may be a real problem here and not just a symptom. That's one of the reasons I invite people to book a strategy session. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session, because what you may think is just a symptom, oh, I need to tweak this, there might be an underlying problem. In fact, one of my clients just did that. Scheduled a strategy session. He was trying to configure a failover cluster, and I realized, oops, there's really something bad in here that you need to address. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. If there is something that needs to be dealt with, whether it's on the design, whether it's on the implementation, it's on the configuration, you need to know what the real problem is in order for you to properly solve and properly support your failover clustered instance or your availability groups. You also need the right skill set, because you are going to be the point person when something goes wrong. You're going to be the point person who will answer questions that everybody else is going to throw at you. And I provide the training for that. In fact, somebody asked, are you still running your always on availability group training class? Yes, I am. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's talk. If there is something that I can help you address these challenges, I'll be more than happy to help you with that. If not, I will steer you in the direction that best support you. Like, for instance, now, good thing that you're following up. I mean, how that difference if we use failover cluster and FCI to configure HA, like FCI will not allow auto failover. There is more to it than what is happening in your design if your failover clustered instance is not failing over automatically. The goal of having a failover cluster is to address high availability, automatic failover, failure detection, and handling and health detection. If your infrastructure and your design is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, then there's something wrong. You need to find the root cause. Like I said, you need those three things in order for you to properly support, whether it's an FCI or an availability group. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. If I can help you address those real problems and not just the symptoms, I'll be more than happy to do that. We'll get clear on what needs to be done and then come up with a strategy on how to solve those problems. All right. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for another topic. And hopefully, we are going to have a beautiful weekend, where I can go out and ride my bike again. Hopefully, I get to do one of these on my bike rides or on my hikes, on my hiking trails, maybe, so long as I got really good internet connection on my phone. All right. That's about it. I'll see you again next week for another topic, for another episode. Have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.